Chapter 41 The Great Urbosa. A story was told about the divine champions of a century ago. They were the representatives of their people, yes, but they were also the embodiments of separate principles. One of the guiding principles that had led to their selection by the royal family was that they should balance each other, to be a perfect and self-contained force even removed from the hero and the princess. It was easy to think of Urbosa as the anchor of that group, the emotional core who could guide the others when there was no other direction forthcoming. However, that thinking was erroneous. She was not a maternal force for any save one. To the rest, she was an equal partner, and the shape of that partnership had been passed down among the Gerudo for generations after. Daruk, it was known, was the protector. No harm could come to the champions while he was with them, and the calamity itself would have to deal with him first before reaching for those he loved. Mifa was the mender, who could heal the wounds of the body like placing water back into a pool. What harm was suffered by the champions, she could undo. Knowing that the clock could be turned back, and fatal wounds rendered meaningless, was treated as its own miracle. Rivoli, chief flyer and warrior of the Rido, was the watcher. He could move through the world in ways that the others could not, could be eyes and ears that they would never have otherwise, could gather information and act on it more quickly than anyone else on the continent. Urbosa, who commanded the lightning, who was feared by the servants of the calamity, was not the mother of that group. She was not the shield, she was not the spear, she was not the heart, she was not the mind. The great Urbosa was the destroyer. It was the destroyer who turned in the middle of the desert to face the blight who had killed her a century before. It was the destroyer whose hair waved in the breeze as she stared down the incarnation of Ganon's hatred. It was the destroyer whose back Regis stared at as a lifetime of stories played out in her mind. The blight shifted. Urbosa raised one finger. Careful, she warned the beast. It flashed, and was gone. The world exploded into a hail of lightning, the roar of 100 thunderclaps drowning out the thunderblight's scream. Riju's eyes followed the scream, found the monster as electricity surged over its body. It was behind Urbosa, swords raised as if to strike, its muscles locked in place by the current surging through it. Thunderbolts fell from the heavens, flashes of white tinged with green, and Riju wanted to look, but she had to shield her eyes from the searing brightness. There was a gap in the thunder. "I told you," Urbosa said. The lightning fell again, redoubling. "I was a fool to think she needed a weapon." There, the true power of the chiefs of the Gerudo, masters of the storm, channeling the blessing of their ancestors. Urbosa turned slowly, languidly, first with her head and then her torso and then her hips, making the motion look fluid and almost musical. The blight was writhing on the ground, now, as the heat of the lightning strikes began to melt the sand beneath its back. "That's not all you can do," Urbosa said. She was smiling. Not a warm smile, not a soft smile, not even an amused smile. An inviting smile. A challenging smile. A destroyer smile. She was right. Of course. Who would know better than her? In one moment the thunderblight was down on the ground, its swords clenched tightly in its fists. In the next moment, half a heartbeat later, it was up, and lightning surged over its fists, and it lunged at Urbosa. Her smile grew wider. Lena was one of the lucky ones. Barda and Leona had definitely gotten the worst of the punishment, while she and Kata went blameless for the events at the Yiga hideout. Well, relatively. The two of them would be shoveling out the sandsill stalls for a month, but that only meant it'd finish around the same time that Bata and the sergeant were done running laps around Gerudo town, just in time to hand the duty off, really. Kata had opted to have a drink on her break. Lena, in contrast, had gone to the wall. She preferred having a packed lunch, and the wall was a nice, mostly solitary place to eat and to think. She clambered easily up the interior of the southern wall, sat on the top with her feet dangling over, and watched the sandstorm roiling. That foe who liked to run laps stopped and gawked up at her, but she ignored him. She only had eyes for the storm. Everyone had been out to watch Chief Riju ride toward the lookout post, thunder helm strapped carefully in place. No one had really known what to expect of all of that. Certainly the gesture was grand enough, riding out toward the divine beast as if to tame it. But the chief had never actually mentioned what her plans were. For all anyone knew, she was just scouting it out. For all anyone knew, the chief was trying to figure out if the Thunder Helm still worked. In the barracks, Lena had knocked the words out of a few mouths who'd spoken unkindly about the chief. That was to be expected of anyone who respected the office, really. And if one of the other gods wanted to speak foolishly, they would be treated in a manner befitting a fool. Fights over that had been getting less and less common over time, especially after the Thunder Helm had been stolen. Still, if Lena was honest with herself, really honest, then she still had trouble thinking of the chief as anything but a child. A child with a lot of responsibilities who was doing her best to shoulder the weight of an entire people. Yeah, or the chief probably wasn't even 5 feet tall, yet. Everything about her, up to and including the cushioning that had been set on the throne like a really fancy bush seat, betrayed that she had been thrust into this position too early. The position of chief wasn't always inherited matrilineally, and while Lena would never suggest, ever, around anyone, that Chief Riju was unqualified, because she most certainly was and she proved it every day, she had to admit that she also thought it was probably too much for someone that age. The chief had Bulliera's help, sure, but if they went that far, why not just have Bulliera be acting chief until Riju came properly of age? That would save the chief a lot of grief, give her time to grow into the role, let the people adjust to the status quo, and everyone trusted in Bulliera, really. That was the sort of thing Lena was thinking as she sat on the wall. She'd been thinking along those lines a lot, and seeing the storm whirling in the distance just led her mind down familiar, well-trodden paths. That wasn't bad, though it could get a bit tedious. Ah, wonder why the storm is fading. She took a bite of her melon wrap, chewed it thoughtfully, paused, looked out at the storm again. She swallowed, nearly choked because she wasn't really finished chewing, and pounded on her chest with her fist while staring at the sands in the distance. What in the world? She wondered out loud, and in her head she wondered if she should run and get Kata. Maybe even get Liana and Barta. She could see Bonaboris now, kneeling in the sands like a tame seal. Off to the side, perhaps a kilometer away from the divine beast, she could see. She wasn't sure. A geyser of darkness, maybe? And lightning strikes. Wishing she could will the world into silence, Lena put down her food and cupped her hands behind her ears, to better hear across the distance. There. She could hear the thunder of that storm. The divine beasts are supposed to have monsters on them. That's what all the stories are saying. Did the chief? Gods, Riju. Lena jumped to her feet, not noticing when the rest of her lunch tumbled off the edge of the wall and plopped to the sand far below her. Now she held her hands over her brow, blocking out the glare of the day so she could see more clearly. Darkness and lightning. So much lightning. More than danced in any sandstorm. Now she could hear it without cupping her ears. If anything, it was getting louder.
Is that what she's using the Thunder Helm for?
She said out loud.
Is Chief Riju fighting the monster?
Tears welled up, unbidden, as she thought of the child chief fighting on behalf of her people, wielding the power of her ancestors against the beasts of Ganon. And we think of her as a child. She fights for us, and we think of her as a child. She leaped down from the wall, back into town. She hit the ground at her roll and was already running when she got to her feet. I have to find the others. They all need to see this. Urbosa's arms came up with a liquid smoothness, her hands pressing against the wrists of the blight and throwing its blows wide. Electricity surged from the monster and into the great chief so that yellow light danced over Urbosa's face and torso. The blight howled in undisguised glee, and that choked off when Urbosa's grinned beneath the thunder helm.
You're trying to use electricity against me now,
she said to it. She was speaking Hylian. Urbosa threw a punch with her right fist. The blight brought up both of its arms in a cross block. Her fist slammed into its forearms, and there was a roar of thunder as lightning exploded from the point of contact. A shockwave of force sent the blight tumbling, skipping over the sand like an enormous stone, its flaming cape whipping wildly around it as it tried to anchor itself. Golden Heel sank into the sand as Urbosa crossed the distance between herself and the beast. Lightning danced across her fingers, but her gait was slow, languid, unbearably comfortable. She could have been out for a midday stroll. This is not like the other blights, thought Paya, who still stood in front of Riju, ready to defend the young chief. How much suffering could we have avoided if Urbosa had been wearing the Thunder Helm a century ago? The blight flashed and lightning struck it, and it crashed into the sand directly in front of Urbosa, who looked down at it. "This isn't a fight." The blight roared and surged to its feet, and the lightning struck it. It powered through the attack and swung its massive blades at the dead chief. "This is punishment." Bolts fell on both Urbosa and the blight as the Gerudo grappled with her killer, grabbing hold of both of its wrists with hers. It brought up its leg to strike at her ribs, and she intercepted with her own. The lightning fazed her not at all, but every strike made the blight writhe all over again, slowing it, making it weaker and clumsier than it would have been otherwise. With a motion that would have made a shaker proud, Urbosa released the blight's right wrist and broke its grip on its left sword, tearing the weapon away from the beast. It swung with the right, and she stepped inside of the blow, smashing against the blight's chest with her shoulder, forcing it back, and then its other weapon was singing in her hands. The Gerudo did not fight in the same way as the Shika or the Yiga, who were strictly concerned with the economy of motion, and Urbosa was as far removed from the gods who had invaded the Yiga hideout as Mitha had been from the soldiers who had distracted Varudha. She was a whirlwind, perpetually in motion, and the light of the sword in her hands traced dazzling walls in the air. The blight intercepted and blocked, but mostly retreated, giving step after step of space as Urbosa pushed forward, and now she was laughing. The blight missed a parry, and Urbosa's swing took it in the shoulder. It howled, lashed out at her with its fist. "Come on." She released the sword, danced back, hopping from one foot to the other like she was preparing to beat the beast to death with her fists.
"Don't you remember? I wasn't ready for you a century ago and you got worked over anyway. If you want to win now, you better fight seriously."
The words escaped her lips and the air shifted. Paya had never been clear on if the blights were intelligent, so to speak. Certainly they could think, in some limited way, and they were aggressively malicious, but she'd never been able to piece together if they were able to understand language or respond to the thoughts of others. She'd never given it much thought, save for those few times when sleep would not find her and she'd let her mind drift. The howl that answered Urbosa seemed to answer Paya, too. The blight understood. Lightning exploded from it in every direction, not into it but from it, and that surge of power was laced with the malice. The sands around it were torn open, dunes ruptured like pieces of fruit, and Paya saw a flicker of motion toward her, toward Riju, and of course she couldn't react in time. This was lightning. The white and black death broke off, healing around her, as if redirected. She did not even have time to see what had happened. Urbosa must have done that. How can she react so quickly? But then Urbosa looked over her shoulder, at Paya, then past Paya.
"That was nicely done, Chief,"
the great Urbosa said. Behind Paya, Riju gave the kind of nervous, terrified laugh that said she had reacted out of instinct, and nearly exhausted herself in the act. Paya glanced at the current chief. Just for a second, Riju was on her feet now, hands held out in front of her. She was shaking, coated in sweat, but she looked determined even more than she looked afraid.
"It's all right,"
Riju said.
"Be ready if it comes near. I'll be ready if it attacks from afar."
An eruption of sound, the pressure at her back, and Paya turned back to the beasts, shield up. The blight swords exploded into glistening shards that spun and whirled and floated in the air, dancing with intent, surging with malice and thunder. It held its arm out toward Urbosa. The hailstorm of death erupted toward her as if launched from a siege weapon. Urbosa snapped her fingers. Paya did not see what happened next. No human senses could keep up with the flash of motion, of power, of sound, of heat. She had an impression that was written hard onto her vision, a streak of twisting light, tracing a path from the heavens to Urbosa's fingers to the shards in the air to the blight itself. That lightning was so bright, so white, that the world around it was rendered black. Paya covered her eyes and fell back out of reflux. The blight was screaming. Paya recovered, holding her sword and shield in front of her. She couldn't see, wouldn't be able to see again for minutes, and her ears afforded her nothing either. Urbosa snapped her fingers again, and there was another thunderclap, another scream, another snap, another crash, another scream. Another. Arms wrapped around Paya's waist as Riju clung to her. Another. The snaps continued. The thunder answered it, and every time it roared the earth shook more and more insistently. The blight stopped screaming after the 8th strike. It stopped making any noise at all after the 10th. The world disappeared into that maelstrom of sound, into Urbosa's fury-given voice, and Paya did the only thing she could think to. She turned to Riju and grabbed hold of the young chief, falling into a crouching position to lessen the area they might present as targets. She threw her sword away, pressing her right palm against Riju's left ear and pressing the right hard against her chest, protecting the chief's hearing as best she could. With her left arm she held up the shield, ready to ward off a blow that she knew would never come. The lightning raged.
Are you ready, little bird?
There was a gap there, Zelda thought. A gap between the person of Urbosa who spoke so kindly to her, even in the middle of battle, who had carried her when she was small and who she had loved like a mother, and a person who was fighting the blight. Zelda could feel both of those people now, played host to both of those women, and realized after a few moments that they weren't different. These were two facets of the same soul.
Little bird?
Yes, she responded, in that vast space where souls could mingle with one another. Urbosa was still bound, but in reaching out to one another they were united as they had been when the great chief has still been alive.
Yes, I am ready.
There were no bodies in that space, but she still felt Urbosa's hand resting against the back of her neck. The touch was warm, endlessly warm, and she had never in her life felt so secure as in that moment.
I am so proud of you. I think that, once this thing is dead, I would like to talk to you for a while.
Something in that thrilled her, more than she had been expecting.
Oh, yes. That will be so wonderful. And not just to me. Riju will want to talk to you, and you can meet Paya and...
A gentle pressure at her back. She reeled in her excitement.
I'm sorry. Yes, I'm ready. Good. This next one will be the last.
Urbosa called on the lightning as Zelda took hold of all the power she could. She felt it, in the physical world, as the grand matron of all thunderbolts fell from the heavens, smashing the blight into the ground, blasting apart its armor, laying its inner malice open to the air above it. The thunder was drowned out, smothered, by the ringing of a mighty bell.
There. Hold still just like that. Good. This will only take a moment.
The soothing coolness of Mipha's power flowed from Zelda's fingertips, along the curve of where Riju's jaw met her skull, pulling down into her right ear canal. Leveraging that coolness meant that Zelda could feel it, chewy, and more than that she could feel the changes that it wrought on Riju's body.
The eardrum is lightly damaged. Do you hear a faint ringing?
Yes, Riju said. She was very calm, for all the things that she'd just seen. For all the things she's just been through, Zelda thought.
That is normal. Give me just a moment.
Riju was kneeling in the sand, and Zelda beside her. 10 meters away was the still smoking depression where the blight had last lain, its malice boiled away by the power of the goddess after its body had been rent asunder by Urbosa's attack. Paya studied this depression with an intensity that suggested she thought that the blight might regenerate. Zelda had already attended to Paya's injuries, as Riju had insisted that she, as chief, could not receive ministrations before anyone else in the party. Zelda was still trying to unpack that, to pull it all to pieces and figure out what that meant. Paya's own hearing had been damaged much more badly than Riju's. That was probably the root of it. You were so happy to lie to yourself. Well, that was true, she supposed. Urbosa's spirit stood astride a dune, looking at the younger women, the distant Gerudo town, and Von Alvarez in turn. She still wore the thunder helm. The ghost fires floated calmly around her, landing her an air of serenity and peace that was almost completely divorced from the unstoppable force she'd been only minutes ago. She was still wearing the thunder helm, making it impossible to tell if she was focusing on an individual or the group. Something in that was comforting, Zelda reflected, even as it made her anxious. There was a space being maintained between them, and she wanted desperately to bridge that gap, but could feel that Urbosa was trying not to pressure her, not to hurry her. She pulled her fingertips away from Riju's head.
That should do it. How do you feel?
The chief of the Gerudo turned her head one way, and then the other, as if to catch the wind. She held her hands up and rubbed her palms together at different positions and different distances around her head. She clapped her hands directly in front of her, once, twice, thrice. Finally, she nodded. All is as it should be. The chief's words were in Hylian, once more for Paye's benefit. Riju rose and offered her hand to Zelda, pulling her to a standing position.
Thank you. It is a great relief to know that I have been spared the consequences of using the power of the chiefs, if only this once.
Using, rather than being near. Curious. Paye stepped over, falling in beside and behind Zelda, instantly assuming the position of guardian and handmaid. If there was any artifice between the three of them now, it was only that Paye had picked up on expectations of the meeting heads of state and was attempting, in whatever way she could, to boost Zelda's standing. Zelda responded sheepishly.
Yes. The lightning was quite severe, wasn't it?
Her eyes wandered to Varnaboris.
Mythos power repairs damage to my body as soon as it's incurred, so I had little time to notice it, but I was wondering whether the Thunder Helm can protect one from such furious light and sound.
It does not. The reply came from behind them. Urbosa strolled down the side of the dune, her steps rhythmic and swaying and communicating absolute confidence, absolute power. She walked with her left hand fixed firmly to her hip. When she reached the bottom of the dune, she wore a knowing, clever, almost teasing smirk.
The Thunder Helm allows the chiefs of the Gerudo to command the lightning, and will even protect us from its searing kiss, but there is nothing that can shield us from its brightness or its roar.
She came to a stop before the three, towering above the gathering.
For most purposes, we never need anything close to the full power it allows us, and so we only call upon a fraction of it, or, more typically, only what power we have within ourselves. If we were to leverage the Thunder Helm in its fullness too often, it would quickly rob us of our sight and our hearing.
Riju turned to face Urbosa fully, setting her feet firmly apart and clasping her hands behind her back. For all that Urbosa was easily twice her height, she managed to give off the sense of actually looking down at the former chief. The sight would have struck Zelda as hilarious, or even obscene, if it weren't for the fact that Urbosa immediately matched Riju's pose, only clasping her hands in front, rather than behind.
Great Urbosa,
Riju said,
you have used the power of our ancestors well. The blight that infested the divine beast Varnaboris has been destroyed by your hand, and the people are grateful for your service.
Urbosa's answer came in the form of a deep bow. Riju continued,
in light of your valor and your fulfillment of your duty, it is only right that I, as your chief, should reward you. However,
and here she paused, as if wrestling with the idea,
there is no means by which I may reward the dead.
Glory? Stories? Thong? Prayer? Offerings. The list was rattled off in Zelda's head before she could even scold herself for it. There was more going on here in this conversation, and she was only thankful that she managed to keep her mouth shut. Urbosa bowed again, straightened, and removed the Thunder Helm. She held it out to Riju, and the chief considered this for long moments before taking it into her own hands.
As you have sagaciously pointed out, Chief Riju,
Urbosa said,
I am no longer among the living, and so cannot receive a reward meant for them. Moreover, I bore no heirs during my lifetime, and so cannot request that my descendant be rewarded in my stead.
After a moment's jostling, Riju tucked the Thunder Helm under her right arm.
That being the case, you may name a beneficiary.
Oh. Urbosa nodded.
Thank you, Chief. In that case, I name the Crown Princess of Hyrule, Zelda, who is the true daughter of...
Urbosa paused. This pause, Zelda felt, was not part of the ritual, and was accompanied by Urbosa looking down at the ground.
The true daughter of my dearest friend, and the daughter of my own heart.
Silence between the four, as Urbosa gathered herself and Riju tried to process what she'd been told, and Zelda and Paye stood and watched like a captive audience.
I would further request,
Urbosa said, her tone softer,
that the reward you grant her be the truth.
That silence became hard, tangible, and Riju's brow drew together as she stared up at her predecessor. The eyes she turned towards Zelda were measuring, similarly hard. Zelda, of course, said nothing.
The truth, then.
Riju breathed in, then out, then turned to face Zelda.
Princess, I imagine you will want time to speak to Urbosa in private.
She nodded in response.
Good. She is not my ancestor, but I hope you will be able to ease her troubles. Regardless. The truth.
Riju's whole face twisted, momentarily, into an almost ghoulish scowl, and then smoothed out, all at once, as if nothing had been wrong.
I will be returning to Gerudo Town. I ask that you two give me at least 2 hours before following. If you could circle around and approach from another direction, that would be doubly helpful.
To call that a surprise would not quite have covered it. Zelda tried to imagine what would cause such a request, found herself inadequate for the task.
I think we can do that. Yes. May I ask why?
Riju nodded.
As Urbosa has asked for the truth on your behalf, I will give it to you.
The younger woman sighed.
If nothing else, this may make proceedings easier. Keeping these things secret always results in complications.
She shook her head.
What was done here, no one in Gerudo Town can know of it. Insofar as the people are concerned, I was here alone, and I alone did battle with the divine beast, taming it with the power of my forebears.
Zelda blinked, looked at Paya, who was staring gape-mouthed at the chief of the Gerudo. Urbosa had lifted her head and crossed her arms, seemed to be taking in the three of them with a look that was equal parts tired and proud. Zelda turned her attention back to Riju.
We were not here at all. No.
Riju swept her hand between them, as if to clear the concept from the air.
You were not. You retrieved the Thunderhelm from the Yiga, and your magic fought against the magic of Ganon in the north. These things the people will learn in time. But the Gerudo will not be beholden to the kingdom of Hyrule. Too many of our sorrows are tied up in the green fields you call home. You brought the Thunderhelm to me, and I used its power to purge Von Avarice of the malice that had driven it to madness.
Urbosa's voice was gentle.
Tell them why.
Riju bit her lower lip, then nodded.
Yes. You've more than earned that. I owe it to you.
She took another steadying breath.
I am young for a chief. There have been some few younger than me, but none that actually governed. The people's faith in me, in the very identity of the Gerudo as a people, is shaken by my youth. And then you appeared, with your miraculous powers, and upended everything anew. Our guards are telling stories about you, right now, and the spectacular battle you had with Ganon in the heart of the Yiga hideout, to say nothing of the light show that went on yesterday.
Light show is very gentle language, Zelda said. She almost regretted it. Almost. Something bitter was sitting in the pit of her stomach. Don't act on it yet.
So it is. The point is that you appeared, and it was like Hylia had stepped out of legends to reassert herself over the world. You haven't spent as much time among the people as I would have liked, but do you know that in the entire city there is only one shrine to Hylia? One, where once there stood nearly 100. Worship of the seven, great heroes from an age-long past, has supplanted worship of the Hylian goddess over the past centuries.
She visibly struggled with this.
It's important. It's important in ways I can't communicate to you. The Gerudo used to have our own gods. We have forgotten their names, and all of their holy places are crumbled to dust, but they used to be ours. Over the millennia, the god of the Hylians supplanted ours. Ours were too closely likened to Ganon, blamed for Ganon, and our faith, our identities, put us at odds with the other peoples of Hyrule. We had little choice but to take your goddess at our own. Do you see?
The bitterness in Zelda's stomach had taken on a different weight. I think I do.
The seven are like beacons for us. We worship those like ourselves, instead of those like you. So few of us think about it, but that change is so fundamental, so important to getting us back on a path to being ourselves and being proud of ourselves, that I will not sacrifice it for anything. Not for fairness. Not for the truth.
Riju placed her free hand on her hip, copying Urbosa's pose.
Not even for you, who just saved my life in my city. For this, I will not apologize.
The wind blew across the dunes, kicking dust into the air, and Zelda blinked at the image of Riju standing in the light of the sun, the Thunderhelm gleaming under her arm. Everything the chief had just told her was true, everything the chief had just told her was inaugurable. Who would I be if I? No. Do not think of it in terms of yourself. That is the same kind of self-centeredness that your people have shown towards us since before history was recorded. Be humble. What use an oracle that does not know her place, or a god who does not know when to withdraw? Zelda caught a glance at Paya, so that when she bowed, deeply and formally with her hands clasped in front of her, Paya matched her. She said, in the smoothest and most formal Gerudo she could muster,
Please excuse my intrusion, great chief. We will return to the city at dusk, and we will approach from the west, by your leave.
Riju inclined her head judiciously, her expression solemn, before answering in Gerudo.
You have it. I will be away, now.
Another moment, another invisible struggle.
I will not bow in appreciation. Still, speaking only as myself. Thank you.
Zelda did not raise her head or acknowledge the thanks. She held the bow until Riju stepped away, and then she heard the sound of Patricia's excited barking as the sand sail tore off across the desert, the chief of the Gerudo in tow. Only when that barking faded away did Zelda straighten, and then Paya after her. They did not climb the dune to watch Riju leave. That would have made them too visible, ruining the entire point of their staying behind, but they did look in the direction around which she would have disappeared. Urbosa stepped in beside them. In Hylian,
she will be a good chief, I think.
Zelda nodded. Paya said,
I suspect that she already is.
The wind was calm, and the shadow of Von Aboris was long across the desert. Von Aboris rose, on a scale that made its motions look ponderous and clumsy, though from the ground its speed, even its alacrity, were all too apparent. Watching it take step after measured step to the southeast, Zelda could not help wondering at the marvel that the ancients had made. How many kilometers could it cover in the course of an hour? A day? A sand seal could outpace it over the sands, but for how long? Could a horse in full gallop match it over flat terrain at all? A beast the size of a castle, carrying weapons fit to do battle with the calamity, and watching it move. Something inside of her felt very light.
She's beautiful, isn't she?
Zelda flinched at Urbosa's voice, reached for something to say, felt her color rise when Urbosa laughed.
Please, don't be embarrassed. As much affection as I have for Von Aboris, as much as I relish the thought of leveraging her against our enemy, I think my favorite thing about her has always been the way you look at her. The wonder in your eyes and the way you try to understand the things that other people don't think about at all. After a century, and so many trials, and so many changes, you're still so much the same, my Zelda. It does me good to see you again.
Zelda did not know how to respond to put words to the feeling of belonging that swept over her. That feeling was almost completely alien to her, alien in a way that said it was almost alien to her past self, as well. She held it tightly against her, burying herself in it while outwardly watching Naboris make its towering way to the mountains to the south. Later, perhaps, she would try to unpack it. Right now she just wanted to enjoy it.
Zelda,
Urbosa said, and Zelda looked up to see that Urbosa's attention was elsewhere.
When will you introduce us?
Paya was standing some 10 meters away, scanning the horizon, pretending that there was anything she could be doing to justify the distance physically separating them. Is she trying to give me privacy? No, I don't think so. I think, right now, she's embarrassed. HM.
Now, if you like.
She raised her voice.
Paya.
The girl jumped, spun around instantly with wide eyes.
Would you mind joining us, for a moment? I'd like to formally introduce you.
The princess understood that there was a social pressure she was failing to pick up on as Paya made her way over, but for the life of her she could not narrow down what that might be. I wish I was better at this sort of thing. Maybe I was, before.
Paya, this is Lady Urbosa, former chief of the Gerudo, who was dear to my mother and is dear to me. Urbosa, this is Paya, from Kakariko village, who has been my companion and protector on our long journey together.
Paya bowed, tripping over a greeting she could not quite get out, and Urbosa, smiling, filled the space.
I might have been able to guess. You are the very image of Impa from a century ago. Oh, GH, thank you.
Paya bowed again.
I am most happy to be compared to my honored grandmother. I am to make your acquaintance, great Urbosa. And I yours. I owe you a debt of gratitude, it seems, for keeping watch over our princess.
Urbosa's warm expression seemed to flash, shifting into a grin that might generously be described as predatory, like someone who has just spotted a person who would be very easy to tease.
You are being very shy toward me, Paya. May I ask why?
Zelda had to fight the urge to leap to Paya's defense.
Urbosa.
But Urbosa was impossible to resist, it seemed, and Paya had turned the color of sunburn beneath the shade of her hat. She cleared her throat, then did so again, before answering.
Please excuse me for any rudeness. I am not very good around new people, and you have a strong personality.
Zelda wasn't sure how Urbosa would take that. Didn't know what to expect. What she was not expecting was for Urbosa to erupt in laughter, so strong and so lasting that the ghost actually held her sides, recalling the pains and limitations of a body she had left behind a century ago. It was nearly a full minute, the entire time during which Paya was alternating between staring in Urbosa in open terror and staring at her own feet in embarrassment, before the dead chief regained enough control to reply.
Strong personality, she says. Oh, you're right. You're right, of course.
She wiped at her eyes, still chuckling.
I'm sorry, that was rude of me. I don't want to make you uncomfortable. Truly, I don't. Please don't give it any thought. In truth, I'd actually been thinking about heading northeast ahead of Zelda, to secure the route.
She bowed again, preemptive in her apology.
It is not that I do not enjoy your company or wish to speak with you more. But Zelda plainly cares about you a great deal, and you about her, and the two of you haven't had the opportunity to speak in so long, so...
It had been a long day, it had been a long week, in spite of how much had been piled on top of her, how much she had been made to feel in the past. How many weeks had the two of them been traveling together, anyway? However many it was, however much her emotional capacity had been stretched in that time, something in what Paya said there stung at the back of Zelda's throat and made her senses burn. It was a simple thing, but it struck her in its tenderness. This was not betrayed in her voice or demeanor.
That is very kind of you, Paya. You do not have to do such a thing, of course, but I appreciate the thought.
Urbosa's measuring stare was like a physical thing filling the air between the three of them. The dead chief actually placed her hand under her chin as she turned something over in her head.
Paya,
she said,
I would like to talk with you more in the future. Oh, of course, Lady Urbosa. Don't. Thank you. In that case, I hope that you will forgive me for taking you up on that offer. I will not keep her too long, but you are right, it has been a very long time, and I would dearly appreciate having her to myself, just for a while.
Zelda, in that moment, had the sense that Urbosa and Paya were genuinely working this out between the two of them. She wasn't being excluded from the decision-making process. Exactly, rather, they were, knowingly on Urbosa's part and probably unknowingly on Paya's, removing the pressure of needing to manage her attentions between the two of them. She had a sense that she should have been offended, maybe even pushed back against this just for the sake of making her voice heard, but as soon as she thought it she became tired. Yes, she would go along with this, happily. She wanted to talk to Urbosa alone. Urbosa walked Paya over to the sand seals, and the taller woman spoke to the shorter for 20 seconds. Paya nodded several times during this, said something to the ground, and raised her hand in acknowledgement of Zelda as she mounted her shield behind the seal. Zelda waved back, and then Paya was off, sailing quickly over the sands, rounding a dune and disappearing. Urbosa returned, and she and Zelda stood in silence for a time, both watching the place where Paya had last been. After a long time, Urbosa said, Little bird, how much do you remember? The wall of her amnesia protected her from something, some loss and grief that she was reasonably sure would kill her as she was now. It buckled, however slightly, at Urbosa's words. Enough, she breathed. No, not enough. But I remember when you came for me outside Karakara Bazaar. And I remember when we traveled to the spring together, and you fished me out of the water. I remember thinking. Urbosa was a ghost, but for Zelda her hands were solid and warm. She was turned, gently, to face the dead chief, and pulled into a firm embrace. She never would have done this while we were alive. She would have tried to maintain a distance between us. For her. For me. Zelda returned the embrace, held onto Urbosa as tightly as she could, as if letting the chief go would see her vanish, as if by the strength of her grip she could stretch out this moment forever. I wouldn't have done this either. How foolish we are with the people we love. She closed her eyes, was teased by memory. The smell of Urbosa's perfume was in the air, as real as if she was physically present, and the wave of nostalgia that washed over her then would have knocked her to the ground if Urbosa hadn't held her up. She was a mother to me. Is, still. There. That was true. That felt good to know. to acknowledge. After another long time, Urbosa's grip loosened, and the two of them released each other. Zelda was proud of her own dry eyes until Urbosa stood, not hiding her happiness and her grief as she wiped her tears. Seeing that, how open Urbosa was with how she felt in this moment, made Zelda feel ashamed of her own reservation. But she understands.
Thank you, little bird. I've spent a century wanting to hold you again. There is so much I want to tell you, to share with you, to ask you, that I could take up your time for days. But I can't. You have so much that still needs doing. People who need rescuing.
Her voice hardened.
Evils that need vanquishing.
Zelda nodded.
I won't keep you. As much as I want to, I won't. But I can't bear to send you away, either. So, understand that I ask this for my benefit as much as yours. Do you have any questions for me?
Laughter bubbled up inside of her, and she managed to fight it down before it burst forth. Do I have questions? I am composed of question, as if they are written on every cell of my body. She marshaled this feeling, not smothering it but reining it in until it was manageable. She picked one point of curiosity out of an ocean.
What did you say to Paya, just now?
The answer came instantly.
I thanked her for protecting you up to now. I asked her to keep protecting you where I cannot, even if the idea of protecting you seemed ridiculous.
Urbosa quirked a grin.
I told her to hold fiercely to her love, and never let the impossibility of it deter her.
All right. Well, fine then.
Is it that obvious? It couldn't be more obvious. That child might as well be carrying a sign everywhere she goes. Even Riju sees it, and she's definitely no more experienced in these things than Paya is. Except in reading stories about it, maybe.
Riju sees it? What does she mean? Several things slid into place, words said seemingly in passing and questions leading down unexpected avenues coming together to paint a picture clearer than she would have been able to see on her own. Zelda nodded, scowling.
I see.
Urbosa laughed again. Eager to change the subject, Zelda groped through the mound of questions piled up inside of her skull. I don't have to ask about our relationship. I understand that well enough. I want to ask about my mother. What? I think you know how that will make her feel, too, and what it will call to mind for her.
Then, Urbosa, did you hate my father?
The laughter stopped, a fire going out when Dawson sang, and Urbosa turned her head very slowly toward Zelda. The space left by that question stretched out, and out, and out.
Dirk has been wagging his tongue, I see.
Her tone suggested that he needed chastising. She figured it out so fast. Does that mean he was her confidant?
Well, he did mention something of the kind, but it was a century ago. At the ceremony that we held for Link, hardly something he could be blamed for now. In fact, I was actually reminded of it by the memory of us at the spring together.
The words were tumbling out in a rush that she wasn't sure she would be able to keep under control. Was actively failing to control. Never mind. If Urbosa had seen her throw up, there wasn't much room for embarrassment anymore.
I was too young to understand, then. When you came to the castle, I heard you shouting in the audience chamber, and I thought you were angry with me. Angry with you?
Urbosa tilted her head, seemed to search through her memory, then her face lit up and she grinned.
Oh, yes, I remember that.
And she let that name roll off of her tongue specifically because it included no title and she plainly relished the disrespect, which even through the walls of Zelda's amnesia made her hair stand on end.
Had it in his head that you would be accompanied by a unit of guards who would ensure that you were not disturbed, and that you would be appropriately guided as to the proper form of prayer. As if the fool had any idea what proper form meant.
I see, Zelda said, again, and she realized she was repeating herself and it sounded like she wasn't listening, but surely it was obvious she was listening. Again the dead chief laughed.
Your father was typical of men who come into power and responsibility that they aren't prepared for and can't understand, perfectly confident in his own expertise despite having no reason to be confident. Yes, I hated him. I tolerated him for your mother's sake, and then for yours, but he never appreciated the burden that the women of your family carry.
She paused.
Maybe that wasn't completely his fault. The secret of the Queens of Hyrule was carefully guarded. But he could not perceive his own ignorance, and that damned the nation. He was an unthinking husband. He was an irresponsible king. He was an atrocious father.
Urbosa grinned.
It felt so good to let loose in front of him, to see his quarters cowering. I wish I had done it more often.
She sighed, wistful.
Well, one more regret for the pile.
Silence again as Zelda digested Urbosa's short speech. She could imagine the scene now. Urbosa shouting in anger, gods staring at each other in panic as advisors looked to the king. She imagined one manicured finger pointing as her father gripped the armrests of the throne until his fingers turned white. It was funny, now, how she thought of him, not as a king but as a ghost. I think that I connected with him more after his death than I ever did during our life together. What a sad, lonely existence. Was that too generous? Too gentle? Something inside of her suggested, not without venom, that she should think of him as harshly as Urbosa did, that she should stand in judgment of him as Dark had. She found it hard, though. 100 years watching the world burn, a century unable to act while standing a lonely vigil over what might have been his daughter's tomb, and then to be an utter stranger when she rises once more. I pity him, she realized. And, yes, pity was all she had inside of her. Not love, not anger, not even regret. Just pity. Pity for a man who was not strong enough to be who the world demanded of him, and not good enough to make up the difference with the people he genuinely loved. And now he is gone, and I can do nothing more to bridge that gap. The thought was the shock running up her spine, and she looked up at Urbosa.
What will happen if we defeat Ganon? If she says.
Urbosa shook her head.
When you defeat Ganon, you're asking if the champions will remain. If we can be your ghostly entourage.
She hadn't meant that, not in those words, but Zelda nodded anyway.
No. As much as I want that, as much as I want to see you finish growing up in a world that doesn't have the calamity's shadow hanging over it, that won't be possible.
She did not soften the blow through her tone, which was matter-of-fact, almost hard.
We were bound to the divine beasts by Ganon's evil, and now we are anchored to the world by the oaths we swore. Once those oaths are fulfilled, everything holding us here will be gone.
Zelda's own voice, speaking words that came out before she could think them.
You'll leave me again.
Where did that come from?
I'm sorry. I don't mean that. I can't think of. I can't.
Control yourself. In this, if in nothing else. Urbosa laid a warm, firm hand on her shoulder. She did not draw her into an embrace again. That touch was meant to transmit strength.
Delta. Little bird. You cannot blame yourself for what happened to us.
She didn't answer. Couldn't. Then Urbosa was kneeling in front of her, staring at her with the same open concern as 110 years ago.
We are dead, Delta. All of us. But that is not your fault. It is not Link's fault. It's not your father's. It is Ganon's.
She sighed.
Do you want to know what I think, having had 100 years to reflect?
She nodded.
All of this, is how things had to happen. What we've suffered, what you've suffered, is all to serve a greater purpose. That might not make things easier, but it is what I believe.
With her free hand she took one of Zelda's.
I am so proud of the woman you've become. The strength with which you shoulder your burdens, the way you look to the future, your willingness to turn to others for help. You are all I've ever wanted for you. The only thing more I can ask is that you be happy. That is asking a lot.
Zelda croaked.
I know.
The hand on Zelda's shoulder moved to Zelda's cheek, the thumb wiping at one of her eyes.
But when the battle is over, when I am gone, I will leave this world with no regrets. And when you say goodbye to me, when we are truly parted, I don't want you to have any, either. I will carry these regrets with me always. I will not let myself forget again. She wants me to let go of my guilt, even the guilt I can't remember. It wasn't my fault.
Wasn't it?
Who would have more right to be aggrieved than Urbosa? Who can absolve me, if not her? There are so many dead by Ganon's hand.
She can't speak for them all. You don't grieve for all of the dead. You grieve for these few that you loved. That was true. It should have made her ashamed, but it was true. What a small, petty, personal thing, but it was an anchor. It kept her in place.
I am not asking you to forget,
Urbosa said. She withdrew the hand on Zelda's cheek, rubbed her fingers together before placing them against her chest.
Remember always, if you must, let that memory guide you. But when regret pulls at you, and you think you will drown, remember that you are loved. Though I am no longer with you, my love will buoy you.
She drew her fingers away, and with it came an orb of light and thunder, softly crackling.
Though I cannot protect you, my fury will be at your beck and call.
Zelda took Urbosa's power and drew it into her own chest. There was a rush as it infused her, coursed through her, and there was fury in it, the potential for change both subtle and radical, tinged by Urbosa's warmth and love and rage. So many people need so many things from me. She only wants me to be well. Is that so much? The more I remember, the harder this is. The more I become the person I was, the more I share in her pains. I can't turn away from that pain. Mifra was, and is, right. Is letting go of them the same thing? Why is it so hard to imagine Ganon being gone? If this ends, wouldn't I be free? Silence. Silence coursing around her and through her, comforting and cool, like wind over the dunes. Zelda imagined how it would be to stand in the light of the day, the sun warm on her skin, under a clear sky in a world where Ganon did not exist. She nodded to Urbosa, who had been a mother to her in another life.
I will have no regrets.
For the first time in more than a century, Urbosa truly smiled, and it was radiant. End of chapter.